John in his healing space has the majority of clients come to him with wanting to address, trauma issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what happens is people will they'll come and they've got, something that there's an experience that they've had, whether it be recent or past, and that experience has actually created a trauma in their body. So they've either got it's either a physical trauma, an emotional trauma, a psychological trauma, a sexual trauma, spiritual trauma, whatever sort of trauma. But that trauma has actually impacted them in some way, and they're stuck with it. And then what they find is that there's probably other similar traumas. So these traumas start building up on each other, and they get to that stage where they just don't feel that they can function. So they're coming to me to undo or let go or change, not the trauma, because you can't change that. It's the effects of the trauma.
Yeah.
So when they've been traumatized, it's actually, and there's different ways to deal with them.
For sure. I think something I see in my work also is trauma is this hard word. We think of the soldiers and their PTSD, we think of like the horrific car accident, but the definition that I really like of trauma is it's a moment where you are unsure, you are unaware, and maybe the choices you made or the story you told yourself in that time to keep you safe caused problems later on.
Yeah.
And when you think of it like that, it's now relevant to everyone.
Absolutely.
It's not just the soldiers and the victims of whatever it may be.
Yeah.
It's everyday people. And I just finished this trauma course, and such an interesting component of trauma is neglect. And I think in Australia, in this kind of society where it's very much middle class and there's wealth and everyone's got shoes, and we're not talking about not going to school without shoes. We're not talking about having no food. We're talking about the things you didn't get that you needed.
Yeah.
The love, the attention, the affection, the worthiness, the whatever. And it usually comes from mum or dad.
Yeah.
And because you didn't get it, you actually don't know you've even got that issue. There's no awareness.
No.
And I'm seeing this so much. I see certain aspects in myself, but in a lot of these people that I work with, always had everything they needed growing up.
Yeah.
But they actually didn't.
Yeah.
There were things missing. And because it was missing, it's like that saying, well, what you don't know doesn't hurt you. Well, it does.
Yeah.
And this neglect space is so interesting. And these psychologists and these smart people talk on this. And because there's no awareness, there's nothing to address. It's not like, hey, I was a victim of.
Yeah.
There's just nothing.
Yeah.
So it takes so much longer to figure out what the issue is.
Yeah, and I guess for them too, because we're all born with these bodies, and these bodies are designed to do certain things like self-healing. You get a scratch, they heal themselves. We don't have to make the scratch heal itself. Even with, you get a virus or an illness, the body will fight it and heal itself. What we're fighting with a lot of the traumas is like an invisible enemy, if you like, because what if for instance, if the body doesn't get the nurturing and the care and the kindness and the loving that it needs, even the human touch, and the human touch that is caring and kind, the body does if it hasn't been used to getting that, even though you haven't had it, there's always in a part of you that there's something missing. There's something missing, but you don't know what it is.
Yes.
And that itself is a trauma. It's a trauma, because how do you find something that's not there? You don't know until someone says, well, you were never hugged as a kid, and you go, oh wow, no. And then once you feel a hug, and you go, wow, that's what a hug is, and how I've missed out on that. And your body can sometimes just cry, and you don't even know why you're crying. It's because it's something that it's craving, but in your mind, you haven't actually been aware of what it was.
Yeah, it's almost like wounded in a child.
Yeah. And because it is a trauma, it's something that the body's not actually, there's something that the body's not getting, so it is, in effect, traumatic, because it's like a missing part of of what makes a human body function at its optimum. You know, you know yourself when you're, and you're laughing, you have that really good belly laugh, and you're in that space, nothing else matters. You feel great, and your body feels great. You feel light and great. Whereas you can be the opposite. If you're feeling depressed and sad and lonely and anxious, and you're right down, and then you go into fear and anger and all these emotions that are very heavy, you can't function.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't even know what's got you into that space.
Yeah.
And, you know, it could be that there is some trauma there that you're not aware of, whether it be, you know, a real trauma that you've had, or it's just something that that you haven't had, you've never had.
Yeah.
And but your body knows, and it requires it. It's like your body knows it requires water.
Yeah.
And it requires oxygen. There's certain things that the body requires, and if it's not getting it, you just think, no, well, I'm happy with myself, and you know, and I'm loving who I am. But sometimes just that, having that person to share it with, or people to share it with, family or friends, whoever it is that you're closest and dearest to. But even with some of them, they may struggle to give you that nurturing that we all require as a human. And so we do go through trauma. And if you don't know what the trauma is, well, how do you ever deal with it?
Yeah.
And in some of the healings I've done with people, I've said to them, wow, all I'm getting is you just need a hug. And then I've hugged him, and I said, no, I had a guy, he was like a bear. He was huge. He was about 6'8", massive hands, and I knew him from the gym. And I'd done a healing on him, and he just hugged me and cried. I said,
yeah, wow.
He had never been hugged. Never been hugged. And all his life he'd been, like, because he was a big bloke, he was like the debt collector for certain organisations. But that wasn't who he was. Inside he was a gentle soul.
Yeah.
So he not only had the memories of a lot of other traumas that he had committed doing the job that he didn't want to do, but he also never had the upbringing of you know, of care and kindness and gentleness, and just being that little boy that he was. He missed out on all that. So he was traumatized for 28 years. He said the first hug he got was when I hugged him, and he was 28 years old, and he'd been working, doing what he'd been doing since he was 15. He was 6'4" when he was 15, 110 kilos.
Shit.
But people just stereotyped him as being, you know, this. And of course, the poor bugger had been traumatized all his life by that upbringing.
This is the other thing I think that's interesting with trauma is, you know, we all know the traumatic story, and oh gosh, what happened to that person was far worse. So we never validate our own.
Yeah.
And so you can have a horrific traumatic event. You could also maybe have your teacher embarrass you in grade 3.
Yeah.
And the emotional response is the same.
Yeah.
And I find that very interesting. You know, there was another study where they were taking people that had been exposed to quite traumatic events and then exposing them to more trauma, and they were really quite immune. And they were taking people that hadn't been exposed to any traumatic events and were looking at the impact of just one traumatic event, and it was horrific.
Yeah.
You know, so it's almost like the more you expose to it, the number you become.
Yeah, you're sort of conditioned, aren't you? Yeah. It's almost, you become conditioned, but not in a real good way. Conditioned, almost like you say, you're being numb to it, or you're being immune to it. So you're desensitized to it.
Yeah.
And then you don't realise, when you're doing it, you could be inflicting trauma on something you don't even realise.
Yeah.
Because you're insensitive or desensitized to whatever that is, you know, whatever that is. Because there are a lot of good emotions. We've got a lot of emotions that don't really serve us, but there's a lot of emotions that do, and that's what being human is. And we're all unique, we're all different, we all have different experiences. And I think, trauma affects us in different ways, but it still affects us all.
That's it. It's a pain story, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've all got one.
Yeah.
No one, and this is.
No one's immune to trauma.
Yeah, no one's immune. No one's above it.
No.
And I think too, when you can kind of sit with that and go, okay, well, what's mine, and dive into it. You know, there's a whole new space to open up in knowing yourself.
Yeah. And sometimes just by talking to someone else about it can actually give you then the awareness of what it is. Because sometimes you might go, I know there's something missing, but I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah.
But just in conversation or hearing other people talk, you go, wow, that resonates with me. Or it just brings something up for you and you go, wow, that's something I've been. But too often people, I think, are worried about speaking their truth by, being judged or scrutinised, and so they don't want to talk about those softer emotions, but they're very real because, trauma, like you say, we talk about the high profile traumas, the ones that are given a lot of publicity, a lot of light, but there's a lot of other traumas that we don't talk about, which people might think, oh yeah, that's nothing. But like you say, if a person hasn't had much trauma in their life and they have one traumatic event, it could be the same as someone that's had lots of trauma and then a really debilitating trauma. The impact on us all, because we're unique and we're different, it still impacts us. We just don't know what the intensity of the trauma is. And then also what our capabilities are to be able to deal with it.
The other thing I think is so interesting, you have the trauma event and it sits down here, and then all of these other behaviors and patterns kind of sit on top of it. Like I've known in myself, in business, for example, the sabotage. So the business will get good and I'll pull it apart because of this self-worth and not feeling like I'm good enough to receive. And so you pull it down. And it all comes back to certain things.
That's right. And if you could go right back to, well, what's the root cause of that, you'll probably find it's the impact of a trauma that's started you behaving that way. And so when you dive down to correct anything, and there's something that I try to do in a healing session, is dive down to what is the root cause. Because you've got a whole host of things that could be on the surface, but what's the root cause holding that in place? Because once you let go of that root cause, everything else goes. And that's the tricky thing, is what was the root cause? What was the trauma? What is the trauma that's holding all of these other traumas and all of these other behaviours in place?
Well, so what's the trauma? But then what are the stories you've attached to it?
What
are you holding from that event?
Because you're feeding the trauma to maintain the trauma.
Because it comes back to the story of. Because it's not the event.
No.
The event's the event.
That's right.
But it's how you perceive it.
And then a lot of people use the trauma to play the victim. So they play up the trauma. They just use it as an excuse to keep functioning as a victim. So I'm always going to be down the rabbit hole because I was a victim.
The victim mentality.
And then the interesting part is that the victim can actually be the perpetrator as well, because the victim can actually use the poor me to control you. So then you go, well, wow, look at the trauma that they've created, but by playing victim and perpetrator, they're actually inflicting trauma onto others. So you actually impact, or reflecting and deflecting your trauma onto others rather than dealing with your own trauma. So trauma can run really deep, and like you say though, Henry, it doesn't matter what the trauma is. What we might perceive as being a light trauma for one person could be quite effective and deep for another. And they do change the way you behave. They do change the way you function. And like you say, you can go into self-sabotage. You start functioning differently, all because of this trauma. And this trauma you could have witnessed when you were a child. Like between the ages 0 and 5, you could have witnessed this trauma.
And you no memory of it.
No, it's in your subconscious because everything's stored there, but something will trigger it, and as you go through life, you have this reoccurring pattern where this trauma that you have now goes back to another trauma, but none of these traumas are actually linked, but they're all trauma, and they all could be, say, trauma through say it was abuse or being made wrong. So whenever you're made wrong now, it actually makes you feel like when you were very first made wrong. But then if you've got from 3 years old to 35 years old, you've got 32 years of all these traumas that all come into one in the now. So this trauma now that affects you now, you feel really bad because it's a culmination of all these other traumas that are linked up behind it. So it's like a bank up of energy behind it. So if you can actually get to the root cause, undo that one, the rest of them will go. Then you can have the memory of the trauma, but then the emotion that's connected to it disappears. And then someone can say to you, well, when you've done that, you can say, well, how do you feel about that? When you think about that now, how does it make you feel? And it's surprising because most people go, actually, I don't feel anything.
Yeah.
And then you know that they've let go of that trauma. They let go of the connection to the trauma.
Yeah. The memory will always remain.
Memory remains.
But the feeling can be transmuted.
Yeah, because what it is, it was real back then.
Yeah.
But why are we making it real now? Why would you want to repeat something that made you feel really depressed or sad or scared?
Yeah.
You know, why would you want to do that? Sure, back then it was that when the trauma happened, the emotion and everything then were real, but they're not real now. Why do you have to repeat it for 32 years?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. I feel like trauma's a big,
It is, yeah.
big space.
It is, and I mean, and there's so many things that spin off from it, and so many people have traumas and they just don't know how to deal with them. But that's something that you and I can help them with.
Yeah. Hope that's helpful. If you have any trauma questions, please shoot them through.